All right. So we are re-recording this from, I think it was January 29th, I think is what we said. So we had a class that we went through this already. This is technically the fourth session of the series we're going through on how we got the Bible. But we had some recording issues and there were just some technical difficulties. So we're re-recording this for no other reason than having it online. So it's literally just me and John here. And so we're going to go back through this and hopefully have something online to go back to if you want to go back and look at it. So actually we need to go back a slide here. So we started off with reviewing some of the things we had already looked at in the past few weeks as we had started this series. And so we've talked about a few things. We've talked about the transmission process of the New Testament. We've talked about textual variants and how they occur. So we've talked about the reliability of the New Testament, how many manuscripts there are. We've talked about textual variants. So there's spelling errors, there's transposition between words. You have people skipping lines because their eyes do that. Harmonizations, and these things happen in these ways. We also talked about criteria for textual criticism. Textual criticism is the process that New Testament scholars have to use to try to get back to the original text. So when we have these textual variants, how do we know what's original? Well, there's criteria for being able to determine what makes the most sense for being an original reading. And we've also kind of steeped into a little bit of what's called the King James Version only movement. And so we're going to kind of take off from there. And we're really going to talk about what I call the big three. So these are the three biggest or most significant textual variants in the New Testament. And they consist of 1 John 5, 7, and 8, which is the Comma Johanneum. It consists of John 7:53 through 8:11, the Pericope Adulterae, and Mark 16, 9 through 20, which is the longer ending of Mark. And these are the three that you'll typically hear from people that are like Bart Ehrman, or people that are like Dan Barker, or people that are really in any opposition against Christianity. They'll usually bring one of these three up. They're the three most well-known textual variants, and even lay people sometimes know about these if they know about any. So we're going to go through these, talk about the reasons for these variants and things like that. And so we're going to start off with it's 1 John 5, 7, and 8. But it's not really the whole verse. It's not the whole verse of 7 and not the whole verse of 8. But you'll notice that the section in red there, it says, "For there are three that bear record in heaven," and then there's a comma. It says, "The Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost, and these three are one. And there are three that bear witness in the earth, comma, the Spirit and the water and the blood, and these three agree in one." Hence the name Comma Johanneum, meaning John's comma. And so this is the section that's added that you'll not find in your modern Bibles like the NASB. For there are three that testify, the Spirit and the water and the blood, and the three are in agreement. And so even most people, they don't really phrase it 1 John 5, 7, and 8. They'll usually just say 1 John 5, 7, because that's where you have the three witnesses, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost. And so the problem with this is that this is the only explicit passage in the Bible pertaining to the Trinity. And so this is why people freak out. This is why it's such a big deal. But this doesn't mean that the New Testament doesn't teach the Trinity. Many early church fathers were discussing the Trinity from the word go immediately after the time of the apostles and disciples of Jesus. If you remember back in the first week, and I had brought up a conversation I had with someone on YouTube, this was one of the verses that he brought up. In fact, he brought up all three of these. But he said, the Trinity, that came along a lot later. And the response I had was that there's a 2nd century church father named Tertullian, and he's actually the person that coins the term Trinity. And so even though you don't find the word Trinity in your Bibles, that's exactly where it comes from. It comes from the 2nd century, and so they were already debating this stuff. This was one of the main things that was being discussed by the early church fathers, and so things like eschatology weren't really issues in the 2nd century as much as something like this was. So we talked about Erasmus, Desideri Erasmus, and how the last time we had the session before this, we discussed how the underlying text for the King James Version is the Textus Receptus, and it was first done by Desiderius Erasmus. And 1 John 5, 7, and 8, this section we call the Comma Johanneum, it wasn't in Erasmus's first edition of the TR in 1516. It didn't appear in his second edition of the TR in 1519. It's only until we get to his third edition in 1522 that we have this reading. And he had 5 editions total, and so from the third edition on, we have it. So as it turns out, the Latin Vulgate, which had become the official text of the church at that time, it did have this section called what we call the Comma Johanneum, but Erasmus didn't have it in his first 2 editions. So the question is why? So there was a man named, I think you pronounce it Stiguna. He's one of the key editors of the Competentium Polyglot. So the Competentium Polyglot was the text that Erasmus was competing with whenever he was trying to be the first to do a printed and published edition of the Greek New Testament. Now the Competentium Polyglot, it's both Old and New Testament, and it's called a polyglot because it's multiple text, it's multiple languages. And so you have the New Testament, which was Greek and Latin, which the TR was also. It was a diglot, so it was the TR, Textus Receptus, was also Greek and Latin, but the Textus Receptus is New Testament only. And so the Competentium Polyglot also has an Old Testament that was Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. And so this was a huge work. It was 6 volumes. Well, 4 volumes of it had been finished, and they were in a warehouse, and it hadn't been completed, and so they hadn't really gotten permission to publish it yet. And so this was the text that Erasmus was racing with to try to get published first, and he did. So of course, one of the editors comes out of the woodwork after he publishes, and he went public slandering Erasmus over the reading of 1 John 5, 7, and 8, the Comma Johanneum, and he contended that Erasmus, he must return the traditional reading found in the Vulgate. And again, this kind of goes back to some of the stuff we were talking about, even with King James onlyism. It's more about the tradition than it is what was original. What did the disciples and apostles write? Even the Vulgate faced these issues whenever it first came about, because it was, again, trying to push back against the tradition of the Septuagint. So Desiderius, perhaps under the pressure or whatever, he agreed to return the reading found in the Vulgate under one condition: if they could produce a Greek manuscript with the reading. If they could find a Greek manuscript with a reading, he'd be glad to put it in there. He says, produce a Greek manuscript and I'll put it in. So they did just that. They produced a Greek manuscript to order, and with the reading that's found in the Vulgate. And so to this day, there are a total of 10 manuscripts with the reading. 4 of those 10, it's only contained as a marginal note. It's not in the main text. So there's 6 that it's in the text, 4 of them it's in the margin, and the earliest Greek manuscript for this reading is 14th century, and that manuscript is called Codex Montfortianus. And so 1300s, you're looking 1,300 years after the time of the apostles before you have this in any Greek manuscript. Now the 14th century manuscript, Codex Montfortianus, isn't the one that Erasmus had. That's not the one that they had, quote unquote, produced for him. But we know this because the wording deviates in that manuscript from what Erasmus has in his TR. So the manuscript that Erasmus used, they actually date that manuscript to the year 1520 because of the history. Scholars are pretty well convinced that they made it to order, that they literally produced this manuscript so that Erasmus would put it back into his Textus Receptus. But if that's not enough, even though we have over 1 million quotations from the Church Fathers, and they certainly discuss and debate the Trinity, oddly enough, these words, they're never found or quoted in these discourses. So you'd think if they had this verse, of anything they could quote when they're talking about the Trinity, this would be one of the hot spots. And remember, the entirety of the New Testament could be reproduced by the quotations of the Church Fathers. We talked about that in the first week. And yet the Comma Johanneum cannot be found for such an important topic. And so, the Church Fathers aren't trying to deliberately dance around this text and it really does exist. They don't have it. They didn't have it at the time whenever it came out of the early Apostolic Church. So finally, you have other versions of the manuscript tradition, which are Coptic, Sahidic, Ethiopic, Syriac, so on and so forth. And we are without a witness for those, for any manuscript containing this reading in other languages until the year 1512. It's a Syriac manuscript. And so one of the things that ought to alarm you right off the bat is that if you think, okay, well, the earliest Greek manuscript was 14th century, meaning 1300s, and the earliest of a version is actually earlier than that, there's a problem. Greek is the primary source, versions are secondary sources. And so if you have a reading pop up in a secondary source before you have it for a primary source, that ought to be in itself a red flag, even if a millennia and a half isn't long enough. But most people really think that the Common Johannium, it began in the Latin and it eventually made its way over into the Greek and into other languages. But so the King James only crowd, they disdain the removal of this reading. They're saying they're trying to remove the Trinity. But there's just not enough evidence to be considered original. This variant would not even be considered viable since our earliest Greek witness is a millennia and a half after the time of the apostles. And so when we talked about textual variants and we said we're concerned with variants that are both meaningful and viable. And so this is certainly a meaningful textual variant. It's one that, it would certainly matter whether it's there or not. Whether it's viable or not, meaning does it have a chance of being original, the evidence is far, it's pretty substantial that it's not. So 1 John 5, 7, and 8, or rather it's just a section of that verse that's referred to as the Common Johannium. So again, King James only advocates insist that the reason this manuscript the reason manuscripts don't contain this reading for such a long period in history is due to the intentional desire of heretical scribes to undermine the deity of Christ and diminish the gospel and things like that. But it's an unlikely charge considering that there are numerous places where Christ's deity is clear, and you can see that the title of God is attributed to the Holy Spirit. And so if that's their goal, they did a pretty poor job of trying to do that. So it just really can't stand. So the next section we're going to talk about is John 7:53 through 8:11, and I'm actually going to have John read that for us. So would you read that for us, please?
Yes, sure will. Then each went to his own home, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. At dawn he appeared again in the temple courts, where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law of Moses commanded us to stone such a woman. Now what do you say?" They were using the questions as a trap in order to have a bias for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "If any one of you is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her." Again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older one first, until only Jesus was left. With the woman still standing there, Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin."
All right, thank you. So this is an absolutely beautiful story. It's a story that everybody loves. The people, they remember it. It's and to quote Bart Ehrman of all people, he says it's in every Jesus movie, and you can find it in even the Passion of the Christ, and the Mel Gibson movie, which is about Jesus' last hours. And yet, what they do in the movie is they make him have a flashback to this moment because chronologically it doesn't make sense for it to be at the time of the cross. But it's just full of Jesus' compassion, of his wit, of his just intellect, and you see all these things working together, and it's one of those stories that just sticks out to people and people love. But it's not original to the New Testament. So the story of the woman caught in adultery, you'll notice in your Bibles, you'll notice these two double brackets around it. Usually Bibles, and there are some that will do this, but most of the time Bibles will not remove this from the text. Most of them keep it in there and will try to flag you with some of these double brackets because they're so big. This one being for John 7:53 through 8:11 and the longer reading of Mark. And so this is called the Pericope Adulterae. It's the adultery story, and it's not found in our manuscripts until the 5th century in what's called Codex Bezae Cantabrigiensis, which is sometimes called D. Although this manuscript is early, it's not without its issues. So 5th century is actually pretty good as far as how early our manuscripts go and stuff. 5th century, it's a manuscript of the Gospels plus Acts, and so 5th century is fairly early considering all things. So it's named after Theodore Beza. So you'll notice Codex Bezae. The codex was graciously donated to Cambridge University by Beza when he recognized that this manuscript is so bizarre, it is better to be stored than read. And so this is manuscripts. A lot of times they get their names from either the people who find them, something dealing, or the place where they're found. And so we have manuscripts like Codex Sinaiticus, which was found at the St. Catherine's Monastery at the Sinai Peninsula, or you have Codex Vaticanus, which was found in the Vatican Library. And so a lot of people, they'll hear Codex Vaticanus and they think Vatican, that's a Roman Catholic text. It's a Greek manuscript. It was found in the Vatican Library, which is huge, and so that's where it gets its name. And so that's usually how these things. So Codex Bezae, after Theodore Beza, Cantabrigiensis because it was given to Cambridge. And so Bruce Metzger, who is perhaps the greatest textual critic of the 20th century, remember he's actually the guy who mentored Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman was his last PhD student before he retired. He states that one must be cautious when comparing the readings from Codex Bezae for the simple reason that it does contain unique and spurious readings that are not found in any other manuscript. This is also the same codex that we discussed the variant from Mark 141, where the manuscript reads that Jesus was angry with the leper who came to be healed rather than compassionate, where we talked about the difference between sprongostice versus orgostice. And so this manuscript, it's not that it's a bad manuscript in one sense. It has a lot of additional readings. And so just like for Mark 141, that's part of the reason that a lot of people don't give that reading a lot of weight, because it comes from Codex Bezae. It's the first manuscript that has that. Well, it's also the first manuscript that has the woman caught in adultery. And so Codex Bezae, it has a lot of additional material that's not found in any other manuscript, and so you have to be careful whenever you're looking at it. Codex Bezae is best used whenever you're trying to confirm readings that are found in other manuscripts. So if we look at something like P66 or P75, and we want to look at Codex Bezae to see if it agrees with it, that's usually how it's used more than trying to start with Bezae for some of these other spurious readings and asking if those are original. So the bigger problem is this. The Pericope Adulterae is sometimes called a homeless text because it doesn't seem to belong anywhere. Once this story begins to pop up in our manuscripts, it appears in a variety of places, including after John 7:36, John 8:12, John 21:25, and sometimes instead of being in John, it's in Luke, after Luke 21:38, after Luke 24:53. And what I mean is that just like Codex Bezae, so manuscripts are oftentimes, this isn't, obviously there's exceptions to the rule, but you have, for instance, Codex Bezae that has the Gospels plus Acts. And so you find a lot of manuscripts that it'll be the Gospels plus Acts, or it'll be like a group of Paul's letters, or it'll be what they call like the Catholic epistles, so being like 1st, 2nd Peter, Jude, James. And so you kind of have these certain groupings that go together. And so in the manuscripts, whenever we have, when we start to have this story pop up, in the manuscripts where we have the Gospels, instead of being in John, it is in Luke. And so it seems to just jump around. It can't find exactly what place it's supposed to go. And we have one manuscript where it's just stuck at the end of all 4 Gospels. And so like this appendix to all of them. And so the reason no one can seem to find out where the passage belongs is likely because it's not original to John's Gospel. Daniel Wallace is known for calling this his favorite story that's not in the Bible. Daniel Wallace, he's one of the world's best textual critics that's in this field. He actually set out whenever he first got into this field, he wanted to be able to prove that this story was original. But the evidence is just so strong against it, he now calls it his favorite story that's not in the Bible. And so even he has kind of conceded to the idea and just has to agree with it. But what's more, this passage, it's not in our earliest and best Greek manuscripts. So you have P66, P75. P66 is our earliest manuscript of the Gospel of John. That is a complete manuscript to some degree. And you have P75, it's another very early manuscript, so P66 is like 2nd century, P75 is late, something like 3rd century. Aleph and B, which are Codex Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, these are literally our 4 earliest manuscripts for the book of John. So if we were trying to look for a reading, these 4, there's nothing earlier, nothing that is as early as them, and none of them have this story. It's missing from our earliest and best Syriac manuscripts, absent from the Old Latin, Old Georgian, Armenian, not found in our best manuscripts of the Peshitta, a 3rd century Syriac translation. So if you remember what we talked about with the Latin Vulgate, so the Latin Vulgate was essentially a standardization of Latin manuscripts. So if you again went back and were looking at how Jerome was asked by the bishop at that time, Damasus, because all these translations of the Latin began to come out where people were just adding and subtracting what they wanted, and they began to see this was a problem. And so Jerome was asked to go back to our earliest and best witnesses, create the Latin Vulgate, which it later became called, and he sort of standardized a Latin translation. The Peshitta is like that for Syriac. It's sort of the same deal, a standardization of Syriac manuscripts. But it's not found in our earliest of that. It's not found in Tatian's Diatessaron, fourfold gospel. So Diatessaron means through the four, and so Tatian, he basically takes all 4 gospels and just smashes them together. The gospels, although not that they teach contrary doctrine or anything, but they all have a certain portrait that they're trying to portray of Jesus. So you have Mark, who's trying to really portray Jesus as the suffering servant. You have Matthew, who's trying to really show and demonstrate that Jesus is King, he's Messiah, and they have this certain scope that they're trying to show us. And so you have John, who's showing him as the Son of God, and not that they all show these things, but they have a certain focus. Well, Tatian just crams them all together, and that's what the fourfold gospel is. He's trying to just have it all in chronological order all together. But we don't find it in Tatian's writings. No early church father writes commentary about this passage until the 12th century, and his name is Euthymus, who declares it unauthentic. And previous commentaries they skip from 752 to 812 because they don't have it. Before we move on to this, just the last thing I want to say is the Gospel of John. I've been fortunate enough to have someone that's teaching me Greek. I'm learning, and I'm at a first grade level. But I can tell you, as me and my Greek teacher Tim Seaforth, as we've been going through the Gospel of John, you start to learn the vocabulary, you start to learn the words. And when we got to John 7:53 through 8:11, it was like I hit a brick wall. It was just completely different language, and it's because I'm not very good that I can tell you it was like my whole world was turned upside down. And then after 8:11, it kind of goes back to the language he was using before. So Mark 16:9 through 20. Would you read?
On John, though, that teaching doesn't contradict his style of teaching.
Oh, right.
So,
yeah.
It fits into his lifestyle, right?
Yeah, actually, and I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the things I was meaning to mention, and I actually agree with this, is that there's a lot of people that seem to think that that is an oral teaching that goes back to an early, real historical event that really happened. We don't have any hard evidence of that, but I tend to agree with it. I think that could be the case, but as far as did John actually write it, the answer is probably no. It would be really, really hard to make a case for it. But yeah, there's top-notch scholars out there. Daniel Wallace is one of them that he says he thinks that it could be of an early oral tradition that had just never made it into the text. So yeah. Would you read Mark 16:9 through 20 for us, please?
Sure will.
Yes.
When Jesus rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had driven 7 demons. She went and told those who had been with him and who were mourning and weeping. When they heard that Jesus was alive and that she had seen him, they did not believe it. Afterwards, Jesus appeared in a different form to 2 of them while they were walking in the country. These returned and reported to the rest, but they did not believe them either. Later, Jesus appeared to the 11 as they were eating. He rebuked them for their lack of faith and their stubborn refusal to believe those who had seen him after he had risen. He said to them, "Go into all the world and preach the good news to all creation. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, but whoever does not believe will be condemned. And these signs will occupy those who believe. In my name they will drive out demons. They will speak in new tongues. They will pick up snakes with their hands, and they will drink deadly poison. It will not hurt them at all. They will place their hands on sick people, and they will get well." After the Lord Jesus had spoken to them, he was taken up into heaven, and he sat at the right hand of God. Then the disciples went out and preached everywhere, and the Lord worked with them and confirmed his word by the signs that accompanied it.
All right, thank you. All right, so the long reading of Mark with the woman caught in adultery, these are the two largest textual variants in the New Testament. They both consist of 12 verses apiece, but Mark's problems, they're different than John's. They kind of have different things going on. So although we find this variant earlier than we find in John's gospel, the problem is we find multiple endings to Mark's this ending here. So it's debated what is original to this ending. So it's debated if there was anything beyond verse 8 at all. Did we lose something? And so that's where the debate is at. Most people would agree that 9 through 20 is not original. However, it's completely different to say that everyone would say, that it ends at verse 8, because there are scholars out there that debate and discuss, did we lose something and things like that. So we're going to look at the issues. The problems are as follows. Number 1, some manuscripts after verse 8 contain a shorter reading that reads, "They reported briefly to those all around Peter all they had been commanded. After these things, Jesus himself sent out through them from east to west the holy and imperishable preaching of eternal salvation. Amen." So, in other words, instead of having verses 9 through 20, after verse 8, they contain this reading. All right, that's number 1. Number 2, there are some manuscripts that only go to verse 11. So you have verses 8, 9, 10, 11, the end. And so here's there's two different readings so far. And number 1 here, just for the sake of when we get to some of this, as we discuss this here in a minute, we're going to call this the shorter ending. So you have the long ending, 9 through 20. Here's the shorter ending. You have this medium ending, through verse 11. We have a manuscript called Codex W. It's Codex Washingtonianus, and an entire paragraph consisting of 90 words. It comes between verses 14 and 15. So it does have verses 9 through 20, but just right in the middle of this, you have this extra 90 words because they didn't have verses back then. And so this is called the Freer Logion, and it's a single manuscript, but it is entirely different than any other thing that we have. We have manuscripts where these verses are omitted from other languages. So Old Latin, Syriac, Old Armenian, you don't find it. And so this is significant for what we talked about before with what's called geographic distribution. And so what you would expect is that if verses 9 through 20 were original, whenever they start being distributed to other languages, they would have those sections. But we find them omitted from the earliest manuscripts of these other versions. Number 5. Many manuscripts, although they contain verses 9 through 20, they're marked with asterisks or obeli to indicate questionable readings. So just like we talked about the previous week, where we started off with John 5:4, which is the description of the pool of water that's being stirred by the angel to heal people and things like that, that once that reading starts to appear, what you see in other manuscripts are that people are trying to indicate to the readers or the scribes that will be copying it that there's something questionable about this section. Number 6, in Codex Sinaiticus, Aleph, and Codex Vaticanus, B, as well as one other early Greek manuscript, which is 304, they do not include these verses at all. And so whenever I first heard about this issue of the longer reading of Mark, the only thing I'd known was that, well, there's 3 really early manuscripts that don't have the longer ending. And I didn't think that was really substantial evidence. I thought, well, 3 manuscripts, what's that against, hundreds or thousands of manuscripts? But it's we're looking at a cumulative case of all the evidence. And granted, Codex Sinaiticus and Vaticanus are 2 of our best, 2 of our earliest manuscripts that are very good. And then we have manuscript 304. It's an uncial. It's one of our, it's an early manuscript as well. 3 manuscripts, it just doesn't seem like a lot. However, once we start getting into some of the evidence that we'll see here in a second, this is actually what ended up convincing me. So, number 7, some of the church fathers were aware of the additional reading. And some of them don't comment on it at all. So you have writers like Clement of Alexandria, Origen. When they do talk about it, it's additional reading, or it's just not in their commentary at all, meaning they probably didn't have it. But Eusebius, who's one of our early church fathers, he's actually the called the father of church history. He's a 4th century writer, and he said that the accurate copies of Mark in his day ended at 6:8, and that the extra verses were not in most manuscripts. So going back to point 6 with Codex Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, what sometimes we don't think about is, especially lay people, is this kind of goes back to an issue we discussed, I think, in week 2, that most of our manuscripts that we have today are from the end of the Middle Ages. So from about the 9th century to about the 15th century, that's where the bulk of our manuscripts are from. They're Byzantine manuscripts, and there's a lot of them. And the further back you go, the less we have, because time will destroy manuscripts, wars, fires, and things like that. But what we do have, when we have early church writers like Eusebius in the 4th century, what we have to consider is that in their day, in their time, Mark, the long reading of Mark was not the majority. It was not in their day. Likewise, Jerome, who's in the same time frame as Eusebius, he's late 4th century, early 5th century. He had the Vulgate, that reading in the Vulgate, but he recognizes that, quote, almost all Greek copies do not have this concluding portion. Again, in his time period, it was not the majority. And so to just simply say, oh, well, there's only 3 that don't have it, not when we look at early church fathers, not when we look at their writings and people that are making commentaries on it. Number 10, the transition from verse 8 to 9 is strange, since the subject of verse 8 is the women, and then in verse 9 begins to talk about he, referring to Jesus. And so you have this ending where the women, they find the empty tomb, they run away, they don't tell anybody, and you're talking about the women, and then it says he, and by that point you're thinking, like, who are you talking about? And then it's, oh, Jesus, okay. And so there is an awkward transition there that it seems like is just tacked on by someone that didn't know what they were doing. And finally, the grammar and style of verses 9 through 20 is vastly different than the words in the rest of Mark. So people that are in this field, that this is kind of above my pay grade, but people that are looking at things like syntax and the words that Mark is using, there's some internal evidence that could strongly suggest that Mark didn't write this also. So there's 11 reasons I just listed that the longer ending of Mark is most likely not original to the New Testament. So you have the long ending, 9 through 20. You have the normal ending, 1 through 8. You have the short ending, where they reported briefly to those around Peter all had been commanded. You have the medium ending through verse 11. The long ending with an additional paragraph, Codex W. And the long ending plus the short ending, meaning there are manuscripts where you have 9 through 20 plus where they reported briefly to those around Peter all they had been commanded. So you have these two crushed together. And then you have, when they start to, this variation starts to pop up, you have asterisks and nobella, you have early church fathers saying that's not the majority reading and all this stuff. And so altogether it seems to point that Mark just ends at 16:8. And again, whether it actually ended at 8 originally, that's still debated and discussed. I personally think it ended at verse 8, but I'm no scholar, so yes, sir.
So what's the additional paragraph? Do we have like the wording for that?
Yeah, I guess I probably could have looked that up, but I don't have it on hand. But
I'm just curious.
Yeah, you could look it up for
What
sure.
it is.
It's called they call it the Freer Logion. So it's again, you could if I was like James White, he actually has it memorized. He was using it, but it's like, man. So, but anyways,
The longer ending doesn't necessarily contradict like Matthew's ending,
right? That's
or Luke's ending. Now John's ending is just kind of different than all 3 of them, because it's a different, it's not the gospel part. But yeah.
So one of the internal problems, and I don't know enough about this stuff to really dig into it, but one of the issues is like, so in the 2nd century, if you're aware that Gnosticism began to pop up, which had different beliefs about things, that some people think that where it talks about Jesus appeared in a different form to them, that this is some early type of Gnosticism thing going on, and it's hard to tell because of the Greek language being used. Like I said, that gets more into syntax and things like that. It's weird, but so like I said, out of my pay grade. But a lot of it doesn't necessarily contradict, but again, it's like what we want to know what they wrote, and we want to have the original as close as we can get. So, but yeah, just because the woman caught in adultery, it's like there's no theological thing missing or added by adding that, or the longer ending of Mark. Even though you do kind of have the Appalachian snake handlers that kind of come from that. They use that section. So
Well, and Paul gets bit by a viper over in Acts.
Yeah.
He doesn't, die or.
Sure.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, Mark's getting his information from Peter as well.
Yeah. Well, that's the
a
tradition. Yeah. So it very well could be, but like I said, I think the evidence mostly does say, if nothing else, 9 through 20. I mean, there's a lot of questions about it. The reason I think it ends at 8 is because everything seems to be tacked on after 8.
Yeah.
So you have all these other endings that everything's consistent up to 8, and then you have different things. So I think it makes a lot of sense. And I did do those in a certain order. So I deliberately started with the Comma Johannian because I think it's the most open and shut case. And then I went to the Pericope Adulterae in John. I think that Mark 16 is the one that most people might argue for and make more arguments for its originality than the others. But these are considered the big three. So skeptics, they love pointing these verses out since they make the Bible seem totally unreliable. So again, people like Bart Ehrman or whoever, I always hate to throw his name out, but he's put the spotlight on himself. But they love pointing this stuff out because they're hoping that evangelical Christians aren't well informed enough to where this will shake your faith. They're hoping to throw out, that the story from John that you love isn't original, and then you go look it up and you quickly see that this might not have been original to the text, and they want it to shake your faith and for you to think, well, if that was added, what else was there? What else has happened? And so there are people out there that will prey on the ignorance of Christians, which is exactly why I think classes like this are necessary. I think it's important to inform people so that they're not caught off guard. In fact, as I was reading, one of the books that I went through as I was doing studying for this is a book by Bill Mounts, and I think it's called Why I Believe the Bible. And he's primarily known for, he has a book in Greek grammar that's used around the world, Basics of Biblical Greek Grammar, and he more specializes in translation. But whenever he was talking about Bart Ehrman's book, Misquoting Jesus, whenever Bart Ehrman talks about these two the longer end of Mark and John 7:53 through 8:11, after he gets done talking about those sections, he says, well, most textual variants aren't this big. Well, Bill Mounts replies to that in his book, and he says, well, what does he mean by most? He says, there aren't any that are this big. And I could get actually how that, just sometimes the way we talk, it's like, well, most of them aren't that big, and you're not really thinking, but Bill Mounts is right. What do you mean by most? We know there aren't any that are this big. In fact, that's why the week before this lesson, what I was been building up to these three, that we talked about 16 independent verses that are not in the New Testament, and they're mostly just repetitions. They're not in our earliest manuscripts. They're repetitions and importations at another place in the text. So you have these three that are, again, the largest. And then the next biggest are those 16 independent verses, which are mostly just repetitions and things like that. And then after that, there's nothing bigger than an independent verse. You have phrases or words here and there. So really, did you have something you were going to? Okay. So really, once you have broken down these problems, you see, well, it's not as big of a deal as a lot of people would make it out to be. There are King James only advocates that will point this out because they want to attempt to prove that modern translations are corrupt. That they're trying to show you, hey, they're trying to take out the Trinity. You need to watch out with these Bibles. They're it's the mark of the beast or whatever, right? And so it's just shrouded by a lot of ignorance. A lot of people just aren't aware of what's going on. They're not aware of the issues, and so you have people that whether they be skeptics, whether they be cultists, pointing these things out. And if we're unaware of them, we might be caught off guard too. I love pointing these verses out to demonstrate just how much that textual variants, these variant readings, they stick out like a sore thumb. So about a year ago, when I was in the jail doing ministry, one of the inmates, he had asked me about, how do you know that they at the Council of Nicaea that the Emperor Constantine didn't insert the deity of Christ? And he was asking me all this stuff, and I actually, as a rebuttal to him, had brought up the woman caught in adultery. And the point is this: the bigger something is you try to shove into the text, the more things that stick out about it. So I said the reason we know that the woman caught in adultery, it's a later edition, is because it has this, and there's this reason, and this reason. And then you can just start listing off all these reasons and say, if you try to do something that dramatic and push it into the New Testament, it's going to stick out like a sore thumb. And so these techniques, these methods, they work. We've tested them. And so whenever we find the long reading of Mark, when we find the pericope adultery, when we find the comma Johanneum, they're actually evidence that, hey, there's all these things, these problems that pop up. We don't have those problems for the deity of Christ. We see it right out of the gate. And so you would have to, imagine a world where people are changing what the early church fathers are saying about the deity of Christ and all these different sources. It's just untenable. And so the fact that there's all these reasons actually demonstrate that there's methods that work and that we can find it. So, in fact, the next thing I want to talk about is it's actually these smaller details that are harder to distinguish. Here's a great example. 1 Timothy 3:16, you'll notice in the King James it says, "And without controversy, great is the mystery of godliness. God was manifest in the flesh, justified in the spirit, seen of angels, preached unto Gentiles, believed on in the world, received up into glory." And you'll quickly notice that the ESV or modern translations will say instead of God, it'll say He. And so again, not to get too much on the King James only stuff, but this is one of the verses they'll bring up saying, see, they're trying to diminish the deity of Christ. It was God that was manifest in the flesh. They're just saying He or He who. But this is actually a really tricky issue. Then this is one of the verses that they'll always bring up, 1 Timothy 3:16. So I want to point you all back to when we got into textual variants, and this was actually a slide I brought up talking about parablepsis occasioned by homoioteliton in 1 John 3:1. But I pointed out what's called a nomina sacra, and you see the blue arrow pointing to it. And I said this is going to come up later. Well, now is that time. Nomina sacra just means there's sacred names of God that they would abbreviate and they would put a line over. So here is it's theta upsilon, and it's the word God, but they condensed it down to 2 letters. They would do this, condense it down to 2 or 3 letters and put a line above it. And this is just something that the early church did as they were copying manuscripts. So God, Jesus, Christ, there's just different names they would do this with, Son of David even, and they would condense it down and do this. So you need to know that for this variant. 1 Timothy 3:16, if we go to Codex Sinaiticus, you'll notice here in the actual manuscript, you have an Omicron sigma, it's os, which is he or who, but you'll notice right above it, you can even tell from here that it's in a different pen. And someone had what you call a first corrector came along and put theta sigma, so theos as a nomina sacra right there. And so the original reading in Sinaiticus says os, it is he who. Whereas you have the theta sigma come along as the first corrector that's trying to put it above the line. Okay? So original does say he who, first corrector says God. We go to Codex Alexandrinus, which is a 5th century manuscript, so about 450 AD. Here's where it really gets kind of tricky. So you'll notice that there's a red circle around here and a red circle around here. And I've blown them up. This red circle here is this one. This red circle here is the one on the far right. And so you'll notice that the difference between os and theos, whenever theos is being used as a nomina sacra, the only difference are 2 horizontal lines. So a theta is basically just an omicron with a line through it. Okay? So in the second occasion here, which is the far right, you can see it is theos. It's a theta sigma. So here it's hard to tell. Not only is it kind of smudged, but you go, oh, well, there's a line above it. Well, as scholars have looked deeper into this line above there is actually added by a later hand, that another scribe came along and added this in a different ink. So this line here was added, and then this right here, there were some scribes that were, as they looked at this, that they found a line through it, but the line is not from the actual the front page here. So just like, and I think the example I used in the class when we were actually going through this, if you get a normal sheet of paper and you get a Sharpie and you write on it, what happens?
Bleeds through.
It bleeds through. What happened with vellum and papyrus also. And so what they noticed when they flipped on the other side, that there is a line there from the other side that has bled through. to make it look like it's a theta, and someone else came along and put the line above it. And so it looks like from Codex Alexandrinus that the original hand of where we have 1 Timothy 3:16, it is os, it is he who. And so these things do get kind of tricky when you start actually getting into what's going on in the text. So I took
the
this.
ESV is technically correct
Yes.
in the translation.
Right.
King James, not saying it's wrong, but according to that, it should be he.
In fact, the thing is that this is actually such a tricky issue that you can make a pretty good case that Theos is the original reading. Because even there's other places where the first corrected is actually the correct reading. So it just depends. So like even James White, who I've got one of his books up here. Even though modern translations have changed it to he who or whatever, he actually agrees that Theos, he thinks it is the original reading, and he's one of these the people that's in this field that does this, and he's pretty objective, but he thinks Theos is original. But just to read something out of Reinventing Jesus here, so for example, in 1 Timothy 3:16, the original Greek text almost surely read, "Who was manifest in the flesh." All but one Latin manuscript has which, or for who, none have God. So later Greek manuscripts have God was manifest in the flesh, and the difference between os and theos is just two horizontal lines or strokes in the letters in the Greek manuscripts. But the Latin words which, quad, and Latin God, deus, are quite different. It is evident that the Latin manuscripts originated by copying a Greek text that had who instead of God. And so that's where I think a lot of it really is helpful to have the early version manuscripts, is because you can tell whenever they were translating from Greek into Latin, you start to see in these other versions, the manuscripts they had said who, they didn't say God. And so I actually lean toward, I think it is he who or he, however you want to translate that. But you have a good enough case based on some of the early readings and things. But this is one of the verses that if you're finding, and I had someone actually bring this up to me that's King James only, but this is one of the verses they will bring up to try to say, oh, they're trying to diminish the deity of Christ. The irony is you can actually turn that argument around on them with verses like this, John 1:18. It says, "No man hath seen God at any time, the only begotten Son, which is in the bosom of the Father, he hath declared him." The ESV, "No one has seen God, no one has ever seen God, the only God, who is at the Father's side, he has made him known." And the difference being monogenes huios, only begotten Son, and monogenes theos, only God. So a lot of people always want to translate monogenes as begotten. And the reason is because monogenes, the word that usually follows that almost all the time is huios, only begotten Son. But monogenes is actually made up of two words. So you have mono, meaning one, and you have genes, which means kind or type. So there are translations that will read the only unique God, the one-of-a-kind God. And so just to kind of tell you what's going on here, our earliest best Greek manuscripts have monogenes theos, P66, P75, Aleph and B. And, but not just that, there's also the internal evidence. So whenever we take we talked about hypotheticals, right? So what I just said a second ago is if you have, when you have the word monogenes, usually the word that follows it is huios, only begotten Son. So if the original wording was, if the original, John originally wrote monogenes theos, would a scribe more likely be accidentally change it to huios because monogenes huios is always how it occurs, or the other way around. So the idea is this: if it originally said monogenes huios, only begotten Son, how would a scribe accidentally change it to theos? Whenever whereas the other way around, you could easily see that happening with a scribe changing monogenes theos as they're copying it to monogenes huios. So most people agree John 1:18, only the unique and only God. But the whole point was that if they're going to say that we're new translations are trying to diminish the deity of Christ, well, we could technically turn that argument around on them and say, oh, you're trying to diminish the deity of God, of Jesus Christ here. But I don't think anyone really thinks that. But it's a matter of having using equal scales, not using double standards and things like that. The guy that I was just talking about that I got in a discussion with that was King James only. And when I say King James only, I mean like militant King James only, like if you're not using the King James, you're going to hell. Just because someone uses the King James doesn't mean that they're King James only. But this is what I call sort of the silver bullet to the King James onlyist. Revelation 16:5. It says, "And what I heard the angel of the waters say, Thou art righteous, O Lord, which art and wast and shall be, because thou hast judged thus." The NASB says, "And I heard the angel of the waters saying, Righteous you are, the one who is and who was, O Holy One, because you judge these things." And so here you have ha esamenos, and here you have ha hasios. And so you might be expecting me to say, well, it's not in our earliest and best manuscripts, yada, yada, yada. Well, ha esamenos is not in any manuscript. It is not found in any Greek manuscript. So, as previously mentioned, Desiderius Erasmus, he was the first to publish the work that would later be called the Textus Receptus. Erasmus died in 1536, and the torch was passed to a man named Robert Estienne, better known as Stephanus, who passed in 1559. It would later be passed again to the likes of Theodore Beza, who died in 1605. So each of these individuals produced a TR with a slightly different text than each other, having different multiple printed editions and published it multiple editions and things like that. And they were all different. So Erasmus had 5 editions, Stephanus had 4 editions, Beza had multiple editions, okay? So Theodore Beza, when he worked on his 1598 edition, when he came to this Revelation 16:5, he made a conjectural emendation. When he saw the reading, ha hasios, O Holy One, he didn't think it sounded right. And he assumed that ha esamenos, who shall be, was the original reading. And so without any manuscript evidence to support it, he changed it. This contends quite the problem for someone that's King James only, especially because they appeal to the majority text. The majority of manuscripts say this. Well, when you appeal to the majority of manuscripts, you never give hand to what the earliest manuscripts say, almost ever. And so if you're going with majority text, it always rules out early manuscripts. But you can't even appeal to majority text here because there are no manuscripts. In fact, before Beza, none of the printed editions had this reading in the text. And so, again, it's about, flipping the question around. And so when someone that is, King James only is saying, oh, you're using a corrupt Bible or something like that, the question I've posed back to them, I'll say, well, what about Revelation 16:5? What do you do with that?
But what's their answer back on that goal? Like, do you
the last time I asked a guy, there was a guy on YouTube I was talking to, and I threw that to him. He didn't answer me back. Okay. So it really is a problem. I mean, because and again, I was going to say this here in a minute, but I'll go ahead and say it now. The issue is, again, it's not about beating up on someone's King James only. It's about having consistent standards, not using double standards, being consistent, and just being able to if someone's going to say that I'm using something corrupt, it's like, hey, there's no such thing as a perfect text anyway, but just being able to say, have that person evaluate their own worldview and recognize that, we are given God's word throughout history and to realize that there's a process that's happened. So, it's not about beating up on someone using the King James Version. The King James Version is a good translation. I have no problems with it, but it's just a matter of consistency. So the problems don't end there for Revelation, though. For the King James Version, this is funny. So Erasmus, if you remember, he had access to about 5 manuscripts when he made his TR, and so for the Book of Revelation, he didn't have any manuscript. And being the resourceful guy he is, he borrowed a Latin manuscript of Revelation that had the Greek in the commentary, and he pulled the Greek out of the commentary of that text. And so the bad news is that whenever he was going through this, trying to extract the Greek out of the commentary of this Latin text, he got to the last page and it was missing. And so the last 6 verses of Revelation 22, he didn't have any source for it. So what does he do? He back translates from the Latin Vulgate into Greek. And so I don't know if you all have ever done this, but if you try to, let's say you have a paragraph, and you use Google Translate and translate it into Spanish, and then you try to have it translate that same paragraph in Spanish back into English, it's going to be completely different. It does not. There is no one-to-one word correlation. And so this means the TR had a reading that's not found in any Greek manuscript before it. And these last 6 verses contain 17 textual variants that are not original to what John wrote in his Apocalypse. But how can this be? Surely someone fixed it before they translated the King James Bible. Erasmus he had multiple editions. You have Stephanus, you have Beza. Someone must have fixed this problem, right? So Erasmus did fix the problem, or so he thought. He thought he fixed it. So given that Desiderius, he was aware of this issue, there were 2 guys that named Bonaventure and Abraham Elzevir, who were uncle and nephew, and they published their first Greek text, which they're the ones that coined the term Textus Receptus. Erasmus called his text the Novum Instrumentum, and it is funny because you'll hear a lot of people talk about the Textus Receptus, the received text, and they'll really give it this, try to make it this elevated thing where it's the text received from God. The Textus Receptus was a marketing ploy. It was a marketing ploy by the Elzevirs here, and so and it worked. But so whenever Erasmus found out their Textus Receptus came out, he contacted John Frobe in his printer, and he said, "Hey, go get the Elzevirs. Go get their he says go get their Revelation, and when we print our edition of it, put their version of Revelation in there." And so he goes and does that, and they think, okay, problem solved. Well, the problem is that the place that the Elzevirs got their reading of Revelation was from Desiderius Erasmus. And so he didn't ever fix anything because it was like, hey, go get their text. Well, they used his, and so there was like this circular thing going on. And in fact, no one had even recognized that this happened. It was like, I think like 300 years before anyone writes about that had recognized that this whole snafu had happened. And so this bizarre reading at the end of Revelation is still what you find in, since it's in the TR, it would be in the King James and New King James, and which is why you would find such big differences between those two. But again, this is kind of where I was going to talk about, it's not about beating up on someone's translation. It's about using even scales, being able to recognize double standards and things like that. So, you got any questions? We're probably going to just stop right there. That's where we left off last time. Anyways.
Thank you for redoing it.
Yeah, absolutely. What do I do here?
So you're going to go to OBS, hit exit, escape.